Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the Washington Outsider Report. Here on the Coalition Radio, with you is Irina Zuckerman. That's me. I'm the editor in chief of the Washington Outsider, and our guest today, originally from Brazil, is Igor Sabino. He's a PhD student, and he's also the director of the Brazilian chapter of the Philos project, and he'll tell us a little bit about what that is and about his studies. We'll be discussing today the recent Biden administration delisting of FARC, a terrorist and a narco terrorist organization in Colombia. What effect that might have on other organizations in Latin America, on Iran's activity in the region, on Israel's relations with Colombia, and what we expect to see in terms of the future of these countries. And but we'll start with an introduction to our speaker. Igor, please tell us a little about yourself, what you're studying, what's the Philos project, and how you ended up working with them.
First of all, good night, good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a great pleasure for me to be here tonight to discuss about these issues that are so important. And as you mentioned, I'm a PhD student. I'm doing a PhD in political science, and I research about issues related to religion and international politics. So right now, my focus is the U.S. foreign policy for the Middle East and the promotion of religious freedom in the region. And I work with the Philos Project here in Brazil. I'm the leader of the chapter, and our activities here in Brazil are focused mainly on promotion of pluralism in the Middle East and trying to educate Brazilian Christians about anti-Semitism and the plight of the persecuted Christians in the region. The Philos Project is a Christian organization based in New York that aims to promote positive Christian engagement in the Near East. And we are doing some kind of work with the Latino community and also in the Western Hemisphere here in Brazil and the rest of South America because it is a very strategic region, not only for the US, but also for Israel and for the US allies in the Middle East.
Oh, that's great. And how did you come? How did you find them? How did you meet with the Philos group?
I met Philos in 2016. I was doing my master's in international relations, and I was writing about the plight of the persecuted Christians in Iraq. And then I found an article written by Robert Nicholson, the director of Philos, at Providence magazine. And then I started following him on Twitter. And then I heard about one of the Philos leadership programs. One of them is called Philos Leadership Institute. So I applied for it. I was accepted, and in 2017, I spent 1 month with Philos traveling around Israel, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, Poland, New York. And after that, I became part of the network and started thinking about ways to promote positive Christian engagement in the Near East, but from Brazil and in Latin America as a whole. We have a lot of connections here in Brazil with the Near East. We have one of the largest Jewish communities outside of Israel, and we also have more Lebanese people living in Lebanon, in Brazil actually, than Lebanon itself. So we have a lot of historical and cultural ties, but unfortunately, these relations they are not always so good, and they are not always explored. So I tried to kind of start this job here, this work here.
Oh, I would most certainly agree with you on that. I'm actually finding it shocking how little serious attention is dedicated in Washington to Latin America and to Brazil in particular. I'm hoping to do in the future a program on BRICS and their and the activities of that bloc, and of course many future programs related to the region. For now, it's suffice to say that outside one or two mentions of regional meetings once or twice a year that a member of the Senate will visit on an annual basis. There's very little discussion of the region, and once in a while you hear about sanctions on Nicaragua or some concern about Venezuela or something of that sort. But overall, there doesn't seem to be a very coherent and consistent policy engagement with any one country that's and nothing that's being discussed. What we hear about the most is the migrant crisis on the borders, but not the roots of those crises or what causes those issues to begin with, for sure, which is very unfortunate. And actually, this is probably why it may come to the surprise of many that Israel has developed so many positive relations with Latin American countries, including with Colombia, including with Brazil. And Colombia for the U.S. has been a long-term partner on security issues, and the president Ruby, a lot has been achieved since then. It's been a little bit more complicated. The refugee crisis in the area, for instance, threatens Colombia's stability. But what has been not discussed until very recently is Iran's activity in that area. We hear sometimes about Iran with relation to Venezuela, to sometimes to the Brazil Paraguay kind of um, Argentina nexus. We don't hear about it with respect to Colombia a lot. This has changed recently when an Israeli businessman was nearly assassinated there, and since then, there's been a discussion that this will actually bring Colombia and Israel closer. Now, what do you think it's true? I mean, I recently saw an article about this that is saying that this cooperation, this intelligence cooperation related to Iran's activities in the area, will actually strengthen um, the two countries. I want to start with that and kind of get to FARC in a little bit. First of all, how did Israel and Colombia develop that relationship to begin with, and how did it come that it's close enough for them to have effectively worked together to basically uncover the cell of assassins and terrorists?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. Well, it's very interesting to trace the beginning of the relations between not only Israel and Colombia, but I think that between Israel and the countries of South America as a whole, and that includes Brazil. When Israel was created, in 1947, when there was the resolution at the UN to divide Palestine and create Israel, some countries they supported the resolution, like Brazil, because of their interest with the U.S., and other countries like Colombia they remained neutral. Colombia didn't vote. Colombia abstained from voting, and then in 1949, 1950, basically all the countries in the region recognized Israel as a country, as a state. And after that, many countries in the region they tried to be neutral concerning the conflict, and that meant supporting all the resolutions concerning the conflict. So that meant also standing basically against Israel in some aspect, because some of the resolutions at the UN concerning the conflict they were very pro-Palestine. Um, but at the same time, there was this interest in these countries concerning what Israel could give them concerning security. So even Brazil, we have a lot of deals with Israel concerning security. But in the case of Colombia, the changing started in the beginning of the years 2000, after the 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror. Colombia is one of the main U.S. allies in South America, so the Colombian government started to see the FARC as a terrorist threat and tried to deal with that in that way. And at the same time, we started to realize that there were some cells of terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas in South America and also in Colombia. We have this here in Brazil, and as you mentioned, on the tri border between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. We even had that incident, the terrorist attack of AMIA in Argentina. And then when the Colombians realized that Hezbollah was also a threat because they were cooperating with the FARC concerning uh, the drug trafficking, they started to cooperate with Israel on security issues. But at the same time, it was a more discreet relationship. In 2019, 18, for example, Colombia recognized the Palestinian state. But when Colombia started to get closer to Israel, there were some concerns, especially in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez, that was aligned more with Iran, started to blame Colombia for siding with Israel. And here in South America, there is a very strong anti-Israel and anti-US rhetoric, especially among some sectors of the left. So there was this idea that Israel is an imperialist state, and Colombia was kind of betraying the rest of South America by siding with Israel. But recently, that changed. Now we have more politicians that are openly pro-Israel, like my president himself, Bolsonaro in Brazil. He says several times that he is pro-Israel, that he wants to move the embassy, the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But in the case of Colombia, it started with the new president, that he became closer to Netanyahu, and Colombia signed an economic agreement with Israel that was very meaningful, and now Colombia is one of the main allies of Israel in the region.
That's quite a shift there, and given the a lot of the populist movements in the region, it's almost miraculous that things have shifted so far and so quickly in the pro-Israel direction. But yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that there's a number of different terrorist organizations in Colombia and Brazil. You mentioned Hezbollah, you mentioned Hamas, and you mentioned the Lebanese communities there. Can you talk about how those communities came about in Latin America? It seems quite quite a different, quite far away from the Middle East.
Yeah. So the Lebanese and Syrian immigration to Brazil started even during the time of the Ottoman Empire, because we had an emperor here in Brazil, and Brazil was still an empire, Dom Pedro II, Dom Peter II. He was a Christian, and he was what we call today an Orientalist. He spoke several languages, among them Hebrew and Arabic. So he decided to go to the Middle East in the 19th century. So he went to what is now recognized as Lebanon, Syria, Israel, in Egypt. And when he got there, he said that Brazil was open for the Lebanese Christians, and some of them started to immigrate to Brazil. Some of them say that they immigrated because of religious persecution, but there's a lot of debate among the historians about that. The fact is that we had a growing migration of Lebanese to Brazil. Some of them were called Turkish because their passport was issued from the Ottoman Empire, but they were not Turkish. They were Lebanese and Syrian Christians, and many of them settled in São Paulo. But then we had the Lebanese War at the end of the 70s, 1970s to the 90s, and many Muslims they started to come to Brazil and settle on the border close to Argentina and Uruguay. And we also have in other Latin American countries a lot of Palestinian refugees that came here after the creation of Israel, and they are mostly Muslim communities, but especially here in Brazil, those who are on the south, they are Muslim, and many of them are have ties to Hezbollah, and Brazil doesn't recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. That has been an issue of a lot of debate inside Brazil, because Hezbollah is also a political party in Lebanon. I think that's also one of the complexities of talking about the FARC and Hezbollah and Hamas, because these are terrorist organizations that now also have a political party branch. So they run for elections, they have political representatives. So the Brazilian government was afraid of recognizing Hezbollah as a terrorist group because that could harm the interests of Brazil and Lebanon, and also um, these Lebanese communities inside of Brazil, their economic ties, and the relations with also the Lebanese community, the Brazilian community actually in Lebanon. The Brazilian government was afraid that it could be harmed if this country recognized Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. So it's really complicated to deal with this. Actually, there isn't much discussion about the role of Hezbollah and Hamas in the south. There were some discussions about that in previous governments because some outlets, media outlets, they used to accuse the left-wing government of being in relations with Hezbollah and Hamas and supporting those groups. So there's a lot of misinformation actually about the status of those groups in Brazil.
What do you mean by disinformation?
uh, we don't, you know, even researchers, political scientists and professors of international relations research about security. They don't research a lot about Hezbollah and the role of these groups. So we don't have much information about them. We don't have like official reports. We know there are some reports by ABIN, that's the Brazilian intelligence agents, but of course we don't have access to them, just the
Yeah.
government. Some former officials, they have written books and said some things. They said that in some moments they warned the Brazilian government to take an action, but the Brazilian government didn't do anything. And right now we don't know exactly what is the official policy of the government concerning these groups. We know they exist, but it's also sometimes complicated to uh, track them because there's a lot of um, laundry of money and illegal activities. So Brazil also has some problems concerning drugs, and our policies on the border are very complicated, and so this part of that.
It's interesting because in the US, one of the main researchers about Hezbollah, Matthew Levine, has actually done a lot of touched on the issue of Hezbollah presence in Latin America, but he is very one of the very few people even here who has delved into that specific area. And I've heard of a couple of researchers, one of whom was planning to go and do some exploring in the near the border area, which we uh, um, discussed briefly, but I'm not sure whether that ever panned out given the issue with COVID that we encountered that made any travel and direct research very difficult in the last um, year and a half. But it does seem to me that there is a big chunk of information missing. For instance, there's a great deal of discussion about Iran's um, creation of cultural centers that both attract members of the Lebanese communities but also appeal to potential converts. And we know how they generally operate from the general scheme of that elsewhere, but there is not a lot of very hard data with respect to the details of the process. We know a number of these centers, but still, it's not very in-depth research about them. I believe they exist also in Colombia and Brazil and other countries.
Yeah, the main centers, they are in Colombia. As I said, we don't have a lot of data about it because even on academia, the main research we have concerning these communities, they are ethnographic researches, fieldwork research, so anthropologists who go and live in some communities. So we don't know for sure, but these activities of these groups are focused more on Colombia and Venezuela because Hugo Chavez had a lot of ties with Ahmadinejad. In 2005, Brazil also was close to Iran, but it was like more a diplomatic thing because Lula wanted to make Brazil a global player. So Brazil even tried to break a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran together with Turkey. It didn't go well. But at the same time that Brazil was receiving Ahmadinejad, Lula was receiving him in Brazil. Lula was also receiving Shimon Peres and the leader of the Palestinian Authority. So Brazil was trying to be like a peacemaker in the Middle East, and that's one of the
Hmm.
reasons why we received Ahmadinejad. Although there was a lot of protest, and the Jewish community, of course, was deeply concerned about these ties. But after Lula, Brazil and Iran got more distanced from each other, especially because after Lula, we had a female president, Dilma Rousseff, so she was concerned about the situation of women in Iran and human rights. But in Colombia, we have these centers, and in Venezuela as well. And basically, they offer free education to those who are willing to become Muslims. So they train some young people, young men especially. They take them to Iran, and they stay there for about 1 month, learning more about the Islamic doctrine and Islamic theology. And those who have the potential to be missionaries, Islamic clerics, they stay in Iran for longer time, prepare themselves, and return to Brazil and produce content in Spanish. And now some of them are starting to produce content in Portuguese as well. But the Iranian community in Brazil, the Muslim Shia community in Brazil is still very small. Uh, the Muslim community actually in Brazil and Latin America as a whole is still very small. So we don't have a lot of data about the activities of the centers and if they are being successful or not in their efforts, because so far we don't have many like prominent, or we don't see a bigger impact on society. We don't see a big number of conversions to Islam, not even online. We don't see much of that.
Hmm. It's interesting. Might also be because there is a strong religious local culture and spiritual local cultures. I think it might be easier to get converts in more disaffected parts of the world. But
Indeed.
that brings us to Iran's cooperation with existing groups, where I think it's more successful in gaining partners and proxies than necessarily direct converts. And that brings me to FARC. Before we get into the potential relationship with Iran or Iran's relationships with cartels, can you tell us, for the audience, what is FARC exactly? How did they originate, and what's the history of U.S. cooperation with Colombia over this issue?
Okay, so the FARC they started in 1964 during the context of the Cold War. There were a lot of Marxist militias in Latin America, and they wanted to create Marxist revolutions, just like what happened with Cuba. And so they started to uh, have like a military branch, a military arm. So this group, the FARC, as they say in Spanish, their name is the Revolutionary Armed Force of Colombia, and they started to use money from drug trafficking to finance their activities, and they started to have some kind of terrorist activities in Colombia. And all they wanted was to seize power, to get into power, and according to their manifestos, create this kind of Marxist society. So for about 50 years, there was this war inside of Colombia, kind of a civil war between the FARC and the governmental forces. I think that almost 200,000 people died because of this conflict. According to the UN, we have 5 million internally displaced people as a consequence of the conflicts between the government and the FARC. And in 2016, after some attempts of negotiations, there was a peace deal between the FARC and the government, and some members of the FARC they created other militias. Others left the FARC as a whole. And now, 5 years after this peace agreement, there's a lot of debate inside of Colombia, because some people say that the government didn't fulfill its part on the agreement, and other people say that the FARC didn't do it. The fact is that there are still armed militias in Colombia. Many of them, the FARC received a lot of support from the Venezuelan government, especially Hugo Chavez, and now also with Maduro. And to make things worse, we also have a lot of Venezuelan refugees living in Colombia. It's almost 2 million Venezuelans are living in Colombia right now. So the situation is really complicated in the country, especially because of COVID and all this political instability in the region. And I can imagine how destabilizing this number of refugees has been for the Colombia political scenario and also for economics and everything, because Here in Brazil, we received just 80,000 Venezuelans. I live in the northeast of Brazil, far away from the Venezuelan border, and I see Venezuelans begging on the street every single day in my city. So I can imagine how complicated has been the situation in Colombia because of the actions also of the Venezuelan government in partnership with the FARC and other actors.
So now that what could you tell us a little bit more about the nature of the peace deal with the Colombian government? What was each party's obligation? What were each party's obligations that people are claiming not to have been fulfilled?
Okay, so this peace deal was considered one of the most complete peace deals ever made between two parts. It has more than 300 pages, and according to the terms of this agreement, the FARC would give up on their military actions. They would not. They would give up their armies and all the supplies. They would give it to the government, and the government at the same time would have the responsibility of reintegrating the members of FARC into society and kind of doing amnestia.
Oh, you cut out for a second. I can't see or hear you. Sentences.